Ever wondered what kind of soul lives in forgotten objects? What stories, besides the written ones, soak into the leather, the paper, the ink? There are diaries that are just records of days, and then there are those that are prisons, paper sarcophagi for horrors that should never be set free. What he found belonged to the second category. It wasn't just a book, it was a bloody diary, an invitation to a madness that had been patiently waiting for a new host. He spotted it in the mess of an antique fair, a small, dark leather rectangle squeezed between tarnished silver teapots and portraits of strangers with empty eyes. There was nothing particularly special about it at first glance, but something called to him. A morbid curiosity, maybe, the same kind that makes us slow down to look at a car crash. He picked it up, feeling the cold and surprisingly supple texture of the leather, as if the skin was somehow still alive. The seller, an old man with dirty fingernails and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, just shrugged and charged him peanuts for it. A tiny price for eternal damnation. He took the diary home to the solitude of his apartment, where the only sounds were the hum of the fridge and a dripping faucet. He placed it on the table, the small block of darkness seeming to soak up the room's light. For hours, he just stared at it, putting off the moment he'd open it, as if some primitive part of his brain was screaming a warning his rational mind refused to hear. But curiosity is a hunger that has to be fed. With shaky hands, he opened the cover. The smell that rose from the pages wasn't dust or mold, but something more organic, a sweet metallic odor, like an abandoned butcher shop. The first few pages were filled with an elegant, almost feminine handwriting, detailing the weather, the harvests, the small dramas of a long-gone rural life. They were mundane, almost boring descriptions of a world that no longer existed. He felt like a fool, a farm wife's notebook, maybe. But then, the handwriting started to change. The elegance gave way to haste. The smooth lines turned into sharp, desperate strokes, gouged into the paper so hard that the next page carried the ghost of the words. The ink, once a uniform black, took on a brownish hue, almost reddish in some spots, as if the writer had dipped the pen not in an inkwell, but in an open wound. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the feverish sentences. The diary's tone had transformed. No more talk of weather or crops. Now the pages spoke of the moon, how it seemed watchful, malevolent. How the nights of its full glow no longer brought beauty, but a heavy, fearful silence. The kind of silence that comes before a scream. The writer mentioned a growing fear in the community. A whisper passed from person to person about livestock found torn to pieces, but not eaten. A cold dread started to creep up the reader's spine. The dripping in the kitchen suddenly sounded like slow footsteps in the hall. That's when he saw the date, scribbled at the top of a stained page, 1912. The diary became a chronicle of what the following pages would call the terror of 1912. The words no longer described a vague fear, but a tangible horror. One night, a scream cut through the village's silence. The next morning, a solid oak door was found ripped from its hinges, with claw marks so deep they looked like they were made by plow blades. The diary's author didn't dare write the word, referring to it only as the thing, or the beast. It described the sound, a guttural growl that seemed half animal, half human, a sound of mixed agony and rage. The reader, sitting in his sterile apartment, could almost hear that sound echoing across the century. He could feel the writer's panic, the hand that trembled as it wrote, the sweat that probably smeared the ink. Reading was no longer a passive act. It had become an experience, a transfusion of fear through time. The diary wasn't just telling a story. It was making him relive it. The night deepened into a gray dawn. But he didn't notice. The outside world, with its passing cars and the life that pulsed on, oblivious to his torment, had vanished. His universe had shrunk, confined to the yellowish circle of lamplight and the terrifying truths held within the bloody diary. Hunger was forgotten, thirst ignored. He had become a willing prisoner, chained to the narrative of that anonymous writer from a century ago. Every word he read was another step deeper into the labyrinth of the terror of 1912. He could feel the rough wood of the cabin floor under his bare feet, the smell of pine and dread soaking the walls. The obsession was total, a fever burning inside him, leaving his eyes red and sunken. He was no longer just a reader. He was a witness, a ghost haunting someone else's memories, feeling the same panic, the same hopelessness. The diary was no longer on the table. It felt like an extension of his own hands, his pale, trembling fingers gripping the aged leather as if it were the only real thing left. The line between the story he was reading and the reality he was living began to break, like a dam giving way to pressure. He read a passage where the writer, driven mad by fear, described boarding up his windows, the sound of the hammer echoing like a desperate prayer against the night. In that same instant, a chill ran down his spine, and he found himself on his feet, walking to his own window, his hand testing the modern lock with an urgency that wasn't his. He went back to reading, diving into the accounts of the full moon, of how its pale glow seemed to suck the sound from the world. The writer described seeing a figure pass by the window, a tall, distorted shadow. At that exact moment, a truck's headlights swept across his building's facade, casting a fleeting shadow on his wall. For one ice-cold heartbeat, the shadow didn't look human. It was too big, too angular, with a hunched, predatory posture. He gasped, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a trick of the light, his mind told him, a product of his exhausted and suggestible imagination. But the seed of doubt, once planted by the bloody diary, was already growing deep, venomous roots. That's when he got to the page that would change everything. The handwriting here was almost unreadable, a testament to sheer panic. The writer described how, on a night of merciless moonlight, he finally saw his tormentor. It wasn't a wolf, not like the ones he knew from stories. It was something infinitely more profane. He described a man, or what was left of one. The creature stood on two legs, the body of a manual laborer, strong and muscular, but twisted into a new shape. His faded orange shirt was in tatters, hanging over a chest that heaved with bestial fury. The face. The diary described a nightmare. Short, dark hair, still combed back like a man who'd gotten ready to go to town, but the face below was a mask of agonizing transformation. The mouth and nose were stretching into a crude snout, from which yellowed fangs sprouted from human gums. And the eyes. The eyes were the worst part. They were unmistakably human, filled not just with hatred, but with excruciating pain, a silent plea trapped inside the monstrosity. One of its hands with thick, black claws was raised, while the other clutched its own chest, as if trying to contain the monster exploding from the inside out. He threw the diary on the table with a strangled cry. The image, described with such terrifying clarity, burned into his mind. It was too vivid, too specific to be just the product of a terrified farmer's imagination. He stood up, staggering, and went to the bathroom, the cold light of the mirror revealing his pale, sweaty face. He looked into his own eyes, searching for any sign of that rage, that pain. He touched his own chest, feeling his racing heart. The story was no longer contained in those yellowed pages. It had escaped. The venom was in his veins. The terror of 1912 was no longer a footnote in history. It was a present threat, a curse that had found a new host through ink and time. The creature in the orange shirt with the tortured man's eyes was no longer a ghost from the past. It was a promise of what the next full moon would bring. Trying to forget was useless. He hid the bloody diary in the back of a drawer, under piles of junk mail, as if burying the object could also bury the image it had carved into his soul. He tried to drown himself in normalcy. He turned on the TV, the artificial sound and vibrant colors filling the apartment, a pathetic attempt to exorcise the shadows with electric light. But the horror no longer lived just in the book. It had seeped into him, acting like a poison that sharpened his senses to fear. Every mundane sound was now an omen. The creak of the floor from the upstairs neighbor became the heavy footsteps of the 1912 creature. The hum of the elevator in the hall sounded like a low, distant growl. He became a prisoner in his own home, a caged animal peering into the darkness, waiting for the predator he himself had invited in. The silence was the worst. In the gaps between the city noises, a heavy, expectant silence would settle in. The same silence the diary's writer had described as the prelude to the hunt. The air in his apartment felt thicker, charged with an invisible electricity. He was being watched. The certainty was as physical as the floor beneath his feet. The first real manifestation came late at night as he was lying in bed, eyes wide open in the dark, faking a sleep that wouldn't come. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible sound. A scratching. It came from the front door. It wasn't the frantic scratching of a small animal, but something slow, deliberate, exploratory. The sound of a claw, thick and hard as rock, testing the wood. His entire body went rigid, the blood freezing in his veins. He held his breath, every muscle tense, waiting. The sound stopped. Silence. He tried to tell himself it was a tree branch scraping against the building, the wind, anything. A logical explanation for an illogical event. But then a new sound hit him, a sound that dismantled all his rational defenses. A sniff. Low, wet and guttural, coming from the gap under the door. It was the sound of something sniffing, tasting the air, hunting for his scent. A bestial, inquisitive sound that seemed to say, "I know you're in there." Panic paralyzed him completely. The terror of 1912 was no longer confined to a century ago. It was right outside his door, separated from him by just a few inches of wood and metal. In the days that followed, the sensory assault continued, turning his home into enemy territory. He started smelling things. A strong, musky odor of wet fur, mixed with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, would appear without warning, even with all the windows shut. The smell would hang in the air for a few minutes and then vanish as mysteriously as it came, leaving behind a residue of pure dread. He checked for mold, for leaks, for any plausible source, but found nothing. The visual manifestations were more subtle, and maybe, for that reason, more maddening. When he'd pass a reflective surface, like the dark screen of the TV or the window at dusk, he'd get the fleeting impression that his reflection was wrong. For a split second, his shoulders seemed broader, his posture more hunched, almost predatory. The image would correct itself so quickly he wasn't sure what he'd seen. But the seed of a new terrible question was planted. Was the threat just outside, or had the bloody diary started a change inside of him? Was the curse a predator hunting him, or a disease consuming him? Unable to stand the uncertainty, he gave in. He opened the drawer and took out the diary again, the leather feeling warm to the touch. He needed answers, even if they destroyed him. He flipped through the pages frantically, past the descriptions of the attacks, looking for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And then he found it. Near the end of the book, the handwriting was almost gone, but the content was clear. The writer wasn't just hiding anymore. He had started tracking the beast's patterns and had discovered the engine driving the horror: the moon. The pages were filled with drawings of the lunar cycle, with feverish notes next to the full moon nights. The writer from 1912 had figured out that the attacks weren't random. The creature didn't just kill out of savagery, it was searching. The final words on that page were a sentence. It doesn't hunt for food, it hunts for company. It seeks to spread its agony. With his heart in his throat, he looked up from the diary and glanced at a cheap calendar tacked to his kitchen wall. His eyes followed the days, and an icy knot formed in his stomach. The full moon was just 2 nights away. The diary wasn't a chronicle of the past, it was a countdown, and his time was running out. Panic is a catalyst. It can either paralyze a man or force him into the most reckless action. For him, fear turned into fury. A fury against the object that had poisoned his life. The bloody diary, the source of it all. With a savage determination, he yanked the book from the drawer, marched to the kitchen, and opened the mouth of the stove, turning the knob until a hissing blue flame leaped to life. The solution seemed so simple, so primitive. Fight darkness with fire. He held the diary over the flame, the ancient leather mere inches from the cleansing heat. He expected the book to writhe, to scream, to turn to ash and set him free. But the leather didn't burn. The flame licked the dark cover, which only sweated a dark, oily resin, releasing an acrid smoke that smelled of burnt hair and rotten meat. And then he heard it. A howl. It didn't come from the street or the hallway. The sound exploded inside his head, a howl of mixed agony and rage, the same sound the diary attributed to the creature. He recoiled with a cry, dropping the book on the floor as if it were a live coal. The truth hit him with the force of a punch. It was too late. The evil was no longer contained in the object. The seed of the terror of 1912 had already been planted in fertile soil, his own soul. Destruction had failed. The only option left was to understand. Maybe, if he could understand the nature of the curse, he could find a weakness. He picked the diary up off the floor, no longer with fear, but with the desperation of a researcher hunting for the cure to a terminal disease. He pored over the stained pages, ignoring the descriptions of the attacks and focusing on the details, on what was between the lines, on any clue the original writer might have left behind. He read about the villagers' futile attempts. They had tried everything folklore dictated. Silver bullets were forged, but the wounds they inflicted on the creature seemed to close almost instantly. Wolfsbane branches were hung on doors, only to be found withered and blackened the next morning. Crosses and holy water had no effect whatsoever on the beast, which seemed to mock their faith. Every page was a dead end, a testament to human powerlessness against this supernatural horror. Hope drained away with every word he read, replaced by the certainty that he was dealing with something older and more powerful than any legend. It was a unique horror, with its own unholy rules. As the night before the full moon fell, his own body became a map of his terror. A deep throbbing pain settled into his joints, a fire that ran through his bones, concentrating in his spine and shoulders as if his skeleton were being slowly remade. His senses, once normal, were now a source of torture. The lamp's dim light hurt his eyes. The sound of his own blood pulsing in his ears was a relentless drum. The smell of dust in the air was so strong it made him gag, and there was the rage. Waves of a wild, baseless fury rose from his chest, so intense he had to dig his nails into his palms to keep from screaming or breaking something. He looked at himself in the dark reflection of the window and for an instant saw the image from the diary. His own eyes filled with a pain and rage he didn't recognize. He saw himself clutching his chest, feeling the same agony the writer had described in the creature. The fight was no longer against something hunting him. The fight was against himself. The transformation described in the bloody diary wasn't an observation. It was a recipe. Just when all hope seemed lost, he found it. His hand, shaking with pain and exhaustion, brushed against the inside of the diary's back cover. He felt a bump, a small leather pocket he'd never noticed. With trembling fingers, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, so fragile it nearly crumbled at his touch. It wasn't a letter or a confession. It was a map, hastily drawn with the same reddish-brown ink, a crude map of the 1912 village area. There were creeks, dirt roads, and a single spot circled several times, with a pressure that almost tore the paper. Next to the circle, 3 words: where it all began. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't an explanation, but it was a place, a destination, a point of origin for the agony now running through his veins. A choice formed in his mind, clear and terrible. He could stay there, in his prison apartment, and wait for the moon to rise and finish the work the diary had started. Or he could go to that place, the epicenter of the terror of 1912, and face the source of the curse. It was a desperate gamble, a pilgrimage to the heart of his own hell. He grabbed his car keys. He was going. The drive was a fever dream, a blur of dark asphalt and trees that twisted into spectral claws in the headlights. He drove away from the city lights, a castaway rowing away from the safety of the shore, and straight into a storm he knew would destroy him. The map from the bloody diary, yellowed and fragile, rested on the passenger seat, lit intermittently by the car's dashboard. It was his only guide to a region that didn't appear on modern maps, a place that time and tragedy had wiped off the map. With every passing hour, the pain in his body intensified. It went from a dull ache to a liquid fire moving through his veins, making his muscles twitch and his bones pop. A low growl vibrated in his chest, a sound he tried to swallow but that escaped like distant thunder. He felt drawn to his destination, a horrible, unnatural feeling of coming home, to a home he'd never known, but that his blood seemed to recognize. The curse of the terror of 1912 wasn't just a story, it was an inheritance, and he was on his way to claim it. He had to ditch the car when the asphalt road turned into a dirt track and finally disappeared completely into the woods. The night air was cold and smelled of decay. He was there. The ruins of what was once a village were scattered through the forest like the bones of a half-buried giant skeleton. Moss-covered stone foundations, a rusted iron wagon wheel being swallowed by tree roots, the ghostly outline of streets that were now just clearings. The silence was the most disturbing thing. There were no crickets, no croaking frogs, no rustling of nocturnal animals. It was an absolute, heavy, suffocating silence, as if life itself had learned to avoid this place. The landscape was stained with a sadness and a fear that had seeped into the soil. He felt, with a terrifying certainty, that he was not alone. Something was watching him from the trees, from the remains of the houses, from the shadows that danced everywhere. The presence was ancient, patient, and hungry. With a flashlight in one hand and the map in the other, he pushed through the ruins. The circled spot on the map seemed to be the center of the old community. As he got closer, the signs of the beast became unmistakable. Thick trees had bark ripped away by claws, marks that went from the ground to a height no known animal could reach. Some marks were old, grey and scarred over, but others were fresh, the sap still leaking from the wood like tears. The musky smell of predator and death hung heavy in the air, a stench that turned his stomach and, at the same time, awoke something primitive inside him. The pain in his body was now a constant agony, and he stumbled with every step, fighting a bizarre and horrifying urge to hunch over, to let his hands touch the ground, to run on all fours. The connection to the source of power was getting stronger, the curse resonating with his flesh. The bloody diary hadn't cursed him. It had only awakened something that was already dormant, waiting for a call across time. He finally arrived. In the heart of the ruins, where the foundations of an old church could barely be seen, stood a tree. A colossal oak, so ancient it looked like a forgotten pagan god. Its branches were twisted like arms in agony, and its trunk, as thick as a small car, was a map of violence, covered in countless claw marks. At the foot of the tree, a dark hollow opened up in the base of the trunk, a mouth that breathed out cold, foul air. This was the place where it all began. He stood paralyzed before it, the map slipping from his trembling fingers. At that exact moment, as if responding to his arrival, the full moon, obscenely large and white, emerged from behind the clouds. The pale light flooded the clearing, and the pain in his body exploded. It wasn't pain anymore. It was a detonation. Every cell screamed, every bone broke and reset. He fell to his knees, a scream tearing from his throat, a sound that started human but unraveled into something guttural, bestial. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was giving in, and from the depths of the hollow in the tree, he heard a low growl in response. The presence that had been watching him was no longer hiding. The wait was over. The full moon's light wasn't a trigger. It was fuel poured on an ember that had been smoldering for days. The pain that exploded inside him was absolute, a force of nature that unmade the man and forged the monster. He felt the wet snap of his own ribs breaking and expanding, the fabric of his shirt tearing like wet paper over a torso that was becoming broader, denser, with a musculature born not of exercise, but of pure, unholy mutation. His knees bent backward at an unnatural angle, and he felt his spine lengthen and curve, forcing him into a half-upright, half-bestial posture. The most excruciating agony, however, was in his face. He raised his hands, which were no longer his, the nails thickening and darkening into claws, and touched his own skull, feeling the bones shift under the skin, his jaw jutting forward, his teeth throbbing in his gums as they transformed into fangs. He tried to scream, but the sound that came out was a guttural snarl, a baritone of pure rage. And through it all, his eyes remained tragically human, mirrors of a conscious soul watching, horrified, its own defilement. That's when the shadow at the base of the tree moved. Slowly, deliberately, the creature from the terror of 1912 emerged from its lair. It was exactly as the bloody diary had described, a nightmarish vision made real. A powerful body, twisted into a form that was an insult to both man and wolf, still clad in the tatters of an orange shirt that time and violence had turned to shreds. The dark hair still combed back. The face, a mask of permanent transformation, a malformed snout from which fangs grew. The creature stopped, and its eyes, those same human eyes described in the diary, filled with a century of pain and an unquenchable hatred, fixed on him. There was no immediate hostility in its gaze, no territorial challenge. There was something much worse: recognition. Like a veteran prisoner looking at the face of a newcomer, seeing in him the reflection of his own fate. The old monster and the new monster stared at each other in the moonlit clearing, separated by a century, but united by the same agony. His consciousness, the man who had bought a diary at a fair, screamed silently inside the cage of his new flesh. He saw the world through a red filter of rage, his new senses flooded with the smell of his own fear and the musty, ancient odor of the creature before him. He looked down at his clawed hands, at the dark fur that now covered his arms, and he understood the diary's final truth. It seeks to spread its agony. The curse wasn't about hunting or killing. It was a lonely, disease-seeking contagion. The original monster didn't want a partner. It wanted a replacement. It wanted to pass the agony on, in the desperate hope that by creating a new vessel, it could finally find oblivion, the peace of a death it had been denied for so long. The diary was the vector, a piece of the monster's soul sent out into the world to ensnare another and bring it to its place, and he, in his morbid curiosity, had answered the call. The two beings remained motionless for a long moment, the forest silence broken only by their low, trembling snarls, which sounded less like a threat and more like a shared lament. The cycle of the terror of 1912 hadn't been broken. It had been restarted. What happened next, the moon wouldn't tell. Whether the old monster finally crumbled to dust, its long watch over, or if the two creatures, master and apprentice, turned on each other in a battle for the primacy of pain, no one will ever know. Perhaps they simply turned and ran into the darkness of the forest together, two howls joining as one, not as a cry of the hunt, but as the eternal sound of agony that would now haunt those woods for another century.